This video is to show you how to kind of get oriented in Lucidchart and how to create UML ER diagrams within it. Now, I assume here that you've already gotten so far as to have created your Lucidchart account and also to have gotten the free educational program. You can see down here they have like links to it if you're not finding it. I do have information on that separately, so please do follow it. And if you haven't got that part done yet, please get that done and then jump into this once you have. What I'm going to do now is kind of bring you from the screen you land on, which is like your dashboard, and create a new one from scratch. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go to document. Specifically, I'm going to hit this little drop down, and you can either search or whatnot, but if you look right down here, it says entity relationship ERD right there. What I'm going to do is pick from here. I'm going to pick this blank ERD. I'm not actually going to take any of the canned stuff because you just got to delete it, whatever. And there's a lot of variations. Some use, crow's feet, some don't. But blank is what we're going to do because we're just going to follow the same format each time. So you just hit create document. It takes a second to load, no big deal. You can title this thing if you want. Let's call it Demo 1 ERD. You can, give it your project name, something like that. But this is your canvas. This is where you're going to start. You can make this bigger. You can see here that there's arrows to kind of grow and shrink it based upon your needs as you make this bigger and bigger and bigger. For this demo, I'm not going to have to do too much of that. We're just going to throw some stuff up here. Most of what you need entity-wise should already be here. If you don't, for some reason, see this entity relationship piece, hopefully you did if you picked the right, blank ERD form. But if not, you can search for more shapes down here. You simply click shapes and then, do your search terms. And you can see here it's already checked off, but if I didn't have that checked off, I could check off entity relationship. There's other stuff in here too, like if you want to check off UML class diagram, UML entity relationship. These are more things that you can use. These should look familiar. They're just like the book, right? We're not actually going to be using those though. And these probably also look familiar, right? Here's our class diagram. That contains operations, which we're not obviously doing that. So I included these really just for show. If you want more stuff, you can. But what I really care about is already here. So let's go ahead and use it. So to start this off, I'm just simply dragging. So I grabbed here. Notice that I grabbed the one with the two sections, and then also the second section having the spot for the keys and the spot for the field. That's really it. You drag this. Notice like if I grab this, like I want to make it bigger, it doesn't actually get bigger down. It only gets bigger across. I'll show you why in a moment. That's because you have to add new rows for it to grow down. But let's just give this a name. So for this first demo, I'm just going to kind of follow along with what I did for the slides. So I'm going to call this user. By the way, notice I'm not using plural. I would prefer if you don't. I think, at the end of the day, consistency is king. There are some people out there that name their relations as plural, but it's much more common today to take the static view, as I was saying in the previous video. So you're talking more to what this entity is supposed to store, right? It's supposed to be a user. All right, so that aside, you then have your keys and your fields, right? So the first field I'm going to create is my ID, which I know is going to be my primary key. So I'm just going to put PK here, and I'm just going to call it ID. Now, I like to follow, case logic that I use in programming. That's just my style. So in other words, I use camel case. So I start lowercase, and then every other, new word is uppercase. I invite you to do the same. I'm not going to deduct points if you don't. So if you want to make it like all capitals, have at it. Shout at everyone. That's okay with me. But I'm going to keep to the conventions I like. It's just easier and cleaner for me to look at. Looking at capital letters makes my eyes bleed. All right, so After that, first name isn't a key, so I'm just going to put that in here. Last name as well. And I want to show you how to add a new row. So notice here how this row is highlighted blue. When that's the case, if you right click, you'll get this context menu, and you have insert row above and insert row below. I just want to show this. I'm going to click off. If I just click, notice I don't have the highlighted blue box around the row, and I don't have the ability here to add a new row. You have to first actually get it to highlight the row. See there where it's highlighted in blue? Now when I right click, I get the context menu I need with insert row above and below. I'll do it again just for fun. Let's see, what else can we put in here? Let's put in email and put in age, right? Now, I'm not necessarily suggesting that this is the stuff you would put in your user table for the project. I actually detailed the user requirements and all the attributes you need for the user specifically in the requirements. So you can go check that out for all of that. I'm not going to waste our time going through all those here. I just want to show how to do this. All right, so let's recreate the user role scenario. So I'm going to bring in another entity here. We're going to call it role. And the first thing we're going to do, I'm using all surrogate keys because that's how I roll. To me, I think there's a lot of value in using the surrogate key and about zero value to not. So 90% of the time or better, I'm using an ID field that's a surrogate key that's only purpose in life is that database's ID. That way I don't have to worry about other IDs. That's just my take. You are welcome to define your primary keys however you like. In fact, don't think because I feel that way that I will deduct points if you're using natural keys. I will only deduct points if you're using, natural keys if I see a flaw in the logic where, it could cause a problem by doing so. To be honest, it's more elegant. If you want to do it that way, I invite you to. I just wanted to kind of talk a little bit about, why I'm not. If I set this up the way I had it in the original slide, I believe I had just user ID here. Now notice too here when I create, say, like, I'm just going to add the name of the role and leave description off. Notice here when I have user ID here as the foreign key, this we know is going to be a foreign key to user. And notice here the name is just ID. This is for, well, two reasons. One is because obviously I already have an ID attribute here, so I can't have another. So when you live in my world and you're constantly using surrogate keys and they're constantly named ID, then you don't want to have overlap. Now, another way you could do this is you could name this user ID. But I actually, and this could be role ID. I'm not a fan of this approach. I mean, it's fine. There's nothing wrong with this. Plenty of places do it. But for me, if I'm in the context of the relation I'm in, it's that thing's ID, right? It doesn't really need more explanation than that. And it only helps me then because when I see a foreign key somewhere, I know when I'm looking at it immediately what that thing relates back to. I mean, I know you could do that anyway, but regardless, that's just my take. So that again is the convention that you will see me use. I'm going to put it back. Let's go ahead and draw out the relation. Now when I hover over this, you'll see that as I go over the dots here, it turns red. So those are the points from which I can connect my association. So let me go ahead and draw it from my primary key here to my foreign key. And by default, it gives me a nice, one-to-many relationship, which is close. This is obviously going to be wrong anyway. So let's leave the one. I'm just going to change it to be, the kind of notation we were using. So a role can have one and only one user, and a user can have, whoops, you got to highlight the line to stay on it. And then notice what I've been doing here is these are the ends. So when you change these drop downs, you change the end of the line. So I'm going to have in this one a zero or many roles. Let's just say for the sake of argument that the way I'm setting this up, it's possible for a user not to have a role. So this is our poorly defined relationship, because we now know that, you know, there'll be all kinds of multiple admins in here and stuff. We don't want to do this, but I just wanted to take a moment to draw a one-to-many relationship so you could see that happen. And again, we read this that a user can have 0 to many roles, and a role can have one and only one user, which, you know, in this context makes sense even though it's broken. All right, so let's get rid of that. I just highlighted it and hit my delete key. I'm moving this over to make room. I'm going to add another box in here, and this one will be user role. Now, I like to name my many-to-many tables relations with the names of the relations that they are joining. That's just been my habit. So again, I'm open to seeing how you do it. I do invite you to do it in such a way, though, that it makes sense. So I'm going to connect here both my user ID and my role ID. Now this is, even for me, this is a time when I don't necessarily need a surrogate key. The natural key makes a lot of sense because they're two different IDs. Let's also throw in here just a attribute of its own. Let's just say is active, because, you know, maybe I want to disable this user role or something and not delete it. It's just to really have another attribute there. It's not important as to the logic of whether or not this is a good idea or not. Now let's go ahead and create our associations here. So make sure you point, so in this case I'm going to user, so I'm going to go like that. And in this case I'm going to role, so I'm going to go like that. Now I have to fix these, so I prefer you to use you will see this done different ways. I prefer you to use in a many-to-many where you are just simply using this relation in the middle as the many-to-many join. I prefer you to use the annotation like I showed in the slides, where you don't actually have the ends here. So let's delete those out. So this will be none. And then on the other side, it's going to be that a role can have 0 to many. Now we're going to remove this out. This will be none. And on the other side, we're going to say that we're going to require that a user has at least one role. So we're going to say that a user has one to many roles. So now again, the way you read this across is that a user can have one to many roles, and a role can have 0 or many users, right? Which makes sense. Again, a role doesn't have to have a user. Perhaps, you know, perhaps the user or the role was just created and doesn't have any users or whatnot. All right, so we've created now what we saw in the slides. I hope you're able to follow along with using the tool. It's honestly pretty straightforward. Like once you get this rolling, I don't think you'll have much trouble with it. You can of course change fonts and points and bolds and everything that you're used to doing, you know, for any other tools that you use. If you want to add some text to the relations, like the book was doing in the earlier parts, you can, like to describe the relation, but I don't require it. That's optional. It's up to you. Again, that was really defined as more of a higher level construct before you were at the point of design where you were kind of mapping more one-to-one what your relations were actually going to be that were created out of this. I mean, you can see by looking at this, these are going to be relations, right? It's not quite what the book was describing at a higher level where that was not certain. So let me now pull up a new one, and we're going to go through and we're going to take an opportunity to reinforce the tool and also see maybe some possible design ideas for the project itself. All right, so we're going to just close this. You can, by the way, just close this window altogether when you want to get out, and you'll see here that the most recent thing you worked on will be just saved here. So I'm going to go ahead, do the same thing again. I'm going to go to entity relationship, blank ERD, create document. And notice it popped this open in a new tab for me. This one I'm going to call map cushion demo 1. And and we need some tables. So let's start with, I'm going to start with a relation called client because it's the simplest. Now, if you remember, one of the big requirements was that our system has to support multi-tenant, I refer to. You could call this table tenant too, you could call it client, whatever you want. I will use those two terms interchangeably. And the idea here was that, like, if we create our map coaching business and we create a server that runs it, and we have multiple schools as clients, multiple school districts, we don't want to have to like recreate this thing for each one, right? We don't want to have to like go in and either go to the school and set up a server and train people and do all that, or we don't want to have to do it either in the cloud, right? Even if it's not on premise, we don't want to have to like create a new server, install the software, go through all that. It would be much nicer and easier if our software was multi-tenant, meaning us as admins could go in and all we have to do is add a client through the UI, and then when the clients log in, they only see their data. Now, if you think about that from a schema, database perspective, what that means is that essentially every time we query for data, where we go to get data from the database, we need to identify which client that the person is a part of. So most likely what that means is that, like, your user table will have a reference to a client ID. It could also, remember, maybe multiple users can be in multiple clients, so maybe there's a many-to-many relationship there. I'm not actually going to put the user table on here, so that's something that you guys will have to figure out. But at the point I log in, right, so like if you use imagine this from the use case perspective, right? So imagine that I am an employee of school district B, and that's the name of it. So their client, tuple here in this table that we're doing right now, is literally going to have a name here of school district B. And we're going to keep this thing nice and simple. It's just going to be a name and description for now. And when I log in, I might have a many-to-many relationship with clients, or maybe there's just one. I'll leave it to you to kind of go through the specs and make up your mind on how that needs to be. And if there's many, I might have to choose, like, which client are you logging in for? But if there's one, or I pick one, then at that point, then what client I'm associated with, client district B, whatever the ID is, let's say it's ID number 2, I'm going to have that, right, in my session. I'm going to know which client this user is associated with. And now every query for every screen, for every piece of information, has to include that client ID so that I can get back just that information. Now, if you haven't seen this before, I know that might sound a little bit convoluted. So I wanted to include this in the demo so that you could see how it plays into some of the other records that we're going to use, right? So here's our client. I'm just going to leave that simple. Like, there might be more fields there. Please don't take anything that I do here in any way as like gospel, that like, well, Brian didn't put any other fields in his client, so there must not have been. I don't even know the description is necessary there, to be honest with you. I just, I'm giving an overview and I'm trying to get you guys going in the right direction, but don't take this in any way to mean like your tables that I demo here have to look exactly like mine. Like, that is not the case. In fact, I would warn against it because I'm probably not being complete here. Okay, so we have a client. What I want to show, I told you I'm not going to do user because, well, for two reasons. One, I don't want to give the whole thing away, but two, user honestly is one of those things that is pretty well documented. So I even give you all those fields. What I want to do, and I want to take an opportunity to explore a new area of this that might be a little bit more convoluted, and it gives us good time to talk about relationships too in a new way, is kind of locations, floors, and beacons. So remember, everything needs to know tenant or client, so I had to have client, and I wanted to tie that in, so that's why client's here. But we're going to focus on that, the location, the floors, and the beacons. That's what we're going to talk about. So location, remember, is like if I'm a client, my school district B, I might have like 10 schools, right? So a location is a school. Now you could opt to call it a school. The problem with that is that even though and it's probably not a problem because I was pretty explicit in my little demo about like what map cushion is, right? And that they're targeting schools, and that's kind of a good thing because it's good to know your clients. But I would be lying to you if I said that no startup ever pivoted. So like not even a little lie, like a big lie. So that's something I always try to keep in my head when I'm designing these things. Could I call a location school? Sure. But is there ever going to be another use case or reason why I'm going to want this to be more abstract? And am I doing myself justice by calling it a school, right? Like, what's wrong with calling it a location? Because if one day a hospital wants to use this setup, to call in for an emergency, because why not? Why would it be called a school? So, take opportunities there to just think about that. These things seem like trivial, but when you're the one who's been working on it for 2 years and you put your heart and soul into it and you're fighting tooth and nail, and then all of a sudden you're like, I gotta pivot, I'm gonna, screw this school district thing, I'm gonna do it for hospitals. Oh crap, what do I gotta change? Everything, right? So do your best to think about that. All right, so our more generic location. Again, I'm sticking with my surrogate keys. You can do whatever you want here. I'm going to have that ID there for that one. I'm also going to have a client ID here. Now, let's just go ahead and draw this right now so we don't forget. This, remember, is the idea that I guess I just flip it this way. Probably should have just dragged it the other way. It would have been easier. Come on, let me click on the line. There it is. So we want to flip these because a location can only have one client, but a client can have many locations. So we need to have a location can have one and one because it has to have a client. You're no good if you don't. And then on the other side, I would say that a client could have 0 locations. Yeah, I don't see why not. So there we go. So now we have that set up. And what else do we need to know about a location? Let's see. So we have the ID, we have the client ID. It definitely needs a name. So, whatever. For now, we can say it's the name of the school, but whatever it is. It needs a description. So let's do that. Probably, it's just me adding stuff that I would normally add. Now, importantly here, I'm going to insert a few of these. It needs the location information. Now, if you remember back to the other video, I described how the location pieces work. And I said, basically, I described the location and then I described the floors within it as saying the location had a maximum and a minimum latitude and a maximum and a minimum longitude. And then the floors fell within those numbers but had their own because they might not take up the whole space, but they also had altitude. So I'm going to want to save that information somewhere here. So I'm going to go with here. I'm going to start with max lat for max latitude, max longe for max longitude, and min lat for minimum latitude, and min long for minimum longitude. For me, this is okay. Like, you guys might add more stuff to this location, and that's okay. But for right now, for me, this is good. Let's go ahead and add now a floor. So, and I have no idea, I might have to move these things around if this is going to work. So remember here, the idea is that a location is going to have many floors, right? So I'm going to start with an ID for the floor. So let's just put in my standard surrogate key here. And then the floor is in fact going to have a location, right? But it's also going to have a client. So you could, now this is, let's just put this in here, but we could debate this actually. there's more than one way to skin a cat, so to speak. And while I'm at it, I'm just going to type in the foreign key here for the floor, or the location, excuse me. So what I was getting at with skinning the cat here is not that I like killing cats, they're cute. It's that you could make a case, and it could be valid, that you don't need client ID here because you have location ID, and location ID has a client ID. You could make that case. But it also requires you then for every query of floors to include locations, and maybe that's not always necessary, right? It depends on your use cases. So this is one of those, like, I'm going to leave this up to you. I want to see what you guys come up with. I'm going to leave this here like this. I just kind of wanted to bring it up as a discussion point. Like, do you need client ID in this table to reference this one like this? Now, this one here, let me see. I can do this, but I just wanted to see. All right, so that's 1 to 1. If I flip this to 1 to 1, will it be happy? Let's see, and it will. Okay, so remember in the other one, I had the lines go in separate places in the other video so they didn't get jumbled. You can join them like this if they're the same here, which in this case it's going to be. So I just wanted to point that out. So it is important to not join them if they're different, because it's not going to be legible, right? So like right now that's readable, but if for some reason this wasn't a 1 to 1 on this side, and well, that's not even something we use, we'll make it as 0 to 1, that quickly becomes harder to read, right? So that's the only thing I wanted to add there. It's okay if they're the same to have them go into the same spot. All right, so we have our foreign key there. Let's do our location. So our location is going to go here, and we're going to flip this because this is the wrong way. So we're going to have a location can have 0 to many floors, and a floor has to have a location, right? So we'll say a floor has to have 1-on-1 only location, and this can be 0 to many, right? Because I guess it's possible that, well, I don't know, I'll leave that up to you. That's another good question, right? Is it possible for a location not to have a floor? It's a good question, because to be honest, as you're about to see, the beacons might be linked to the floors. So what use is a location without a floor, but you might decide there is one, right? This is part of the art of design. Like, you have to decide these constraints to make it work. You have to make these constraints in such a way that your software is going to work. And there is no, like, golden rule that, like, this isn't like, oh, well, it's somebody else's job, this Johnny's job. No, it's your job. Like, like, just because it's not apparent, you have to figure it out, right? And that's the beauty of the design process. All right. So we have our floor. It has a location ID. It has a client ID. What else does this thing need? The floor probably needs, it needs latitude, longitude, minimum, all that good stuff. Okay, yeah, we'll give it a name too. Let's add some rows here. So we'll give it a name. We're going to give it a bunch of new rows here because we're going to fill in some more info. Now, I'm not going to fill them all in because it's just going to take too long, but I am going to describe it. So just like we had lat, longe, that kind of stuff, I'm going to leave description out. Well, actually, yeah, I'll add description because I have an extra space. Just like we had max lat, max longitude, all that good stuff, we're going to have that here too. But I'm not going to do mins, so just they're implied. It's not that I'm leaving them out because they shouldn't be here. I'm actually leaving them out just because I'm lazy. So here, well, you know what? Let me just add at least one of them just so you can see it, because I don't want you to think that they're not supposed to be here. So one more. And then what I want you to know is that you should have at least 2 more, one for longitude and one for altitude for minimums. All right, so remember a floor, I said, is a subset of the location spatially that a location is, right? So the location has to span the whole thing. A floor might span that whole same base, but maybe not. Maybe some floors don't, right? If you think of some tall buildings, upper floors are smaller than lower floors. And if an upper floor is bigger than a lower floor, you have to judge the location max lat and longitude by the biggest floor in every dimension, right? Or the combination. If one floor goes, furthest out in this direction, and a different floor goes further out in that direction, that's your max and min for the location, right? The furthest out points. So the floor, though, also includes altitude, because remember, we said that we also care about how high we are. Maybe 0 to 10 feet is the first floor, 11 to 20 is the second, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So that matters for the floor. Now let's go ahead, we're going to add a beacon. So the beacon table, now, remember, these are the beacons that we're going to place around the floor. So we're going to give the beacon itself an ID, which this would be a good place for a natural key since the beacon has its own UUID, but I'm just going to stay consistent. Again, it's up to you to decide how you want to do this. But the beacon is going to have its ID. It's going to have a client ID, obviously, because we need to know which client this beacon is associated with. It's going to have a few fields like proximity ID. So, whoops, not here, sorry. So I mentioned in the other video that, I lost some stuff there. I mentioned in the other video that a beacon has three major parts to how it identifies itself. The proximity key is that UUID piece, and then there's the major key and minor key. I apologize if I'm not keeping the terms exact. I don't have the other video in front of me to double check myself. So hopefully I am. But basically there was the UUID, the major key, and the minor key, and those are the ones I'm going to be adding now. And there's probably some other information for the beacon, but I'm going to leave it up to you to kind of discern that. So, but what we said is that the combination of these three things uniquely identifies any Bluetooth low energy beacon anywhere, right? So proximity ID we said was like that UUID assigned to the client. The major ID was the ID of the location that you put it in for the beacon grouping part, not our location up here. And whoops, I put major twice. And the minor ID is the actual number of the beacon in the location. So actually I have some beacons here I can show you. So what I did is so this was location 4. I don't know how well you can see that, but I would write the major and minor IDs on the beacon, so I knew which one this was. The UUID was always the same UUID for us, as map cushion. But this one was location 4, beacon 91. So in one location, this was the 94th beacon. So those don't have to relate to these IDs, but you could do that if you want. Just make sure that it's apparent by the naming and everything what you're doing. Okay, so that's a beacon. Now the last thing we need to do is figure out how we're tying the beacons to the floor. Now this is a part that I want to see what you guys come up with. I'm going to offer a conversation here, and I'm going to kind of point out some ways to do it with the ER tool. But I want to see how you guys decide ultimately to make this happen. So one way I could do it is I could add here a foreign key for the floor ID, right? And I could then draw, my one-to-many here, and I could say that we could say that a floor has possibly many beacons, and that a beacon can only reside on one floor. Now, remember, I should flip these so it's, as we said, one and only one. I want the range, and we could say that a floor has 0 to many beacons, right? And it's completely plausible that a floor doesn't have any beacons before you start putting them there. So now, like, that's one way we could do it, right? And you could make a pretty valid case that this is accurate, because, you know, a beacon hypothetically can only reside in one place at one time. Okay, you know, I'd buy that. And if you do it this way, again, I'm not advocating which way is right or wrong. Then you'd have to have additional information here about the placement of the beacon, right? I'd have to know within the floor what is the latitude, the longitude, and the altitude of this beacon placement, right? So let's go to blow. Let's go blow. And let's do longitude. I was abbreviating it that way, and altitude, right? So if you chose to do it this way, that would work, right? But if you decide there's a scenario in which, you know, maybe you mark a beacon inactive on some floor and it goes to a different floor, or you can actually assign those major and minor IDs. So, you know, beacon does have its own, the way I did it, beacon does have its own primary key in the database. You know, depending on how you work your constraints, there's actually nothing to stop you from having a beacon with the same client ID or proximity ID, major minor ID, the way I have it set up now. So maybe there's, you know, a different way to do this. So I'm going to delete this row, delete this row, delete this one here, and the last one, and I'm going to create a new table. This is kind of like an alternate method. Again, I'm not advocating which one's right, wrong, or indifferent. I want you to do that. But let's create a thing called beacon deployed beacons. I like that, deployed beacons. I don't even think I called it that the first time. And deployed beacons is going to be a combination of the floor, so the floor ID, and the beacon, so the beacon ID. And then additionally, it's going to have those pieces that we were talking about. At a minimum, it's going to have to know the latitude, the longitude, the altitude, that kind of stuff. So let's add a couple more here. And fill them in. Whoops. And now we'll draw out the relations here. So we're going to go from here to here and here to here. And then we're going to fix them so that in this case, hypothetically, and again, not advocating whether this is right or wrong. I'm just doing it, and you tell me what you think by doing it in your project. This one is none. This one over here is none. And this. All right, so that's the other possibility, right? We could make it a many-to-many. I'll let you decide what you're going to do. I'm just having fun playing with the tool. So I didn't put a client ID in that one either, so that's another question on whether you'd have that there. Whether you stay consistent with the client ID or you imply that you're going to have to look it up somehow, but just make sure you explain what your thinking is there. Feel free to make boxes on these, text boxes, and comment and do all that stuff. I think I covered really what I wanted to here, which was just to get this started and get you used to the tool, and also to expose you to some of the ideas and the actual relations. I promise it's going to be, you know, relatively hard. If you guys have never done any kind of you know, larger scale design project before on the database side, you know, there's a lot to do here. There's a lot to think through. So for example, like, you know, let's take this another step mentally further. I'm not going to keep drawing and driving you crazy, but, you know, this is how we can associate a beacon with a floor, right? So if you imagine the map, right, of the school, I showed some in the demos on the last video, right? And you imagine I said one of the requirements is that the UI has to allow the user to drag and drop the beacons, right? To literally just like click and place them on the screen somewhere. So I have my map, and I know I physically placed a beacon in a certain corner of a certain room. So I have my laptop. So I bring the mouse to that same corner on the map, and I click, and I want to add a beacon there, right? What am I actually doing? I'm recording at that moment the latitude and longitude, and by proxy the altitude, I'll get to that in a moment, of where I clicked, because when it's showing the map, right, it has a max and a minimum latitude and max and a minimum longitude, and you can mathematically say, and like take that in total span, and then figure out how many pixels relate to a certain amount within that span, and then figure out where you clicked, and then figure out, where you were within the span, right? Were you 60%, further away from the min and towards the max? And then what does that relate to in 60% of the difference between the min and the max numbers, right? And then you can take that number and save it. Now remember, you're not going to have to actually write the software to do that process. You just have to think through, how do I design the database to store what's required to do this thing, right? And what the database needs to be able to do is store the location I clicked on, right? So that's what it's going to do. It's going to mathematically figure out what the latitude and longitude was of that two-dimensional space that I clicked. Now, the altitude it can actually get from the floor. So you could also make a case here, and I would listen to it, to say, well, I don't need to store the altitude, right? If I have a floor ID and it's linked to the floor, and the floor has a altitude, but it is a minimum and a maximum. So, maybe one day I do want to make this a three-dimensional program view and place the beacon in 3 dimensions, because it actually would make it more accurate, in the sense of when it's determining floors, it actually did it by looking at the total RSSI strengths, the radio strengths of all the beacons, and then taking the floor that had the strongest showing, so to say. There was a little bit more to the algorithm than that. But if I had the actual altitude, because maybe some beacons are high and some beacons are low, I could probably refine that algorithm a little bit more. The practical way that we actually did it was just kind of keep it all uniform, and that worked the same. But maybe not. Maybe one day you do want to take it to the next level. So, at any rate, that was a little bit of rambling about altitude, and storing it specifically in the beacon deployment. But I wanted to kind of give you an idea of what those things do. So, we talked about location, having that absolute min and max for all the floors, and then in the floor, you have some subset of that space, right, for each floor, and that can vary by floor. And then for the beacon, I'm saying, like, where did I actually, position this thing? But there's also the other piece to this that we haven't discussed at all, right? Which is, I have these devices and they're reading the beacons, right? So the way it worked is you had a device, let's just say it was this phone, but it was some lanyard or something, and it has the ability to pick up the Bluetooth low energy beacons. We would have a client software running on this, so it was either written or Android or iOS or whatever, and it would every like half second look to see how many beacons it found. It would record the radio strength that it picked up of that beacon, which gave you an implication of how far the beacon was away, and it would bundle all that information up and send it back to the server. Now we need a way in our database to record that, because remember, we have to know the history. We have to know at any given moment each reading that this phone made. So we're going to need a table to store that in, right? We're going to need some kind of beacon report table that's going to say, device A on, at time whatever reported seeing this beacon, and then it also reported seeing this one and this one and this one. And you're going to have to record each and every beacon that it actually saw, so that later the algorithm that you don't have to write can look at that information and say, okay, so at this time, based on these 5 signal strengths that were recorded at that time, I can derive, as I talked about with the triangulation in the kind of GPS analogy last time, that you are located here, right? Um, so you still have a lot of work to do here on the database side, and please, this is where I said earlier, like, ask me questions. Like, I know this is hard, and it's supposed to be. This isn't supposed to be like, Gormanly's driving us nuts because he has this stuff in his head, and obviously he knows it and we don't. That's the point, right? The point is to give you the experience of what I guarantee you will most likely experience if you ever, are in any kind of situation where you have to build these things, architect a system like this, is interpretation of the requirements and the design ideals into the actual design. Like, that's what we're doing. That's this step. And this makes it real because, it's a really difficult thing to conceptualize out into a data model. And that's the job I'm giving you. All right. So I'm in danger of rambling on forever, and I probably could. So please use the forums, ask me questions. Don't feel that any of them are stupid questions. There are no stupid questions, just stupid answers. And that's it. So I hope you have a great night, and I will see you soon.